In 2017, a UK-based NGO uncovered the enormity of the global trafficking of animal body parts to supply the Chinese medicine industry. Every year, about 2 million animals fall victim to a trade that is driving the species towards extinction in parts of Africa and Asia. The highly sought-after product is smuggled together with CITES-listed wildlife and other illicit products. It sounds like a typical conservation crisis. We've all heard of the brutal trade in rhino horn and elephant tusks. But this story is different because it doesn't feature as a conservation concern at all. Because in this story, the animal does not count as part of nature. This animal is a donkey. The global slaughter of donkeys is driven by rising demand for a traditional Chinese medicine called yijiao. It is made from donkey skins, boiled down to gelatin. The finished product now sells for up to $500 a kilo. Soaring demand is causing severe harms to donkeys and to people, particularly in Africa. Poaching of donkeys and smuggling of skins is driving international crime and local poverty. Donkeys are widely known as domesticated animals, but less well known is that many of the Earth's donkeys are wild animals. They are the descendants of domestic donkeys that were abandoned or escaped. The resurgence of wild donkeys is nothing less than a miracle and one of the biggest rewilding events in the world. Most equid species went extinct thousands of years ago at the end of the Pleistocene. The ancestor of the donkey is the African wild ass, a critically endangered species with fewer than 200 mature individuals remaining in the wild. Their feral descendants number around 5 million. The largest populations are in the remote deserts of Australia and North America. But conservationists typically do not recognize feral animals as wildlife or as rewilding. They are seen as invasive species or as livestock that have stepped out of line. In Australia, wild donkeys are considered a threat to nature that should be controlled or at least put to use. In the Northern Territory, wild donkeys are declared pest species, so mass killing is common, but some also use them for trophy hunting. The territory government has now taken this even further and developed a business plan to export the skins of donkeys to China to capitalize on the international yijiao market. Mostly, however, Australian conservationists just want wild donkeys gone, extinct if possible. In Western Australia, a wild donkey eradication program in the Kimberley region has been ongoing for decades. The most common way to eradicate wild donkeys is with the Judas method. It is named after the biblical tale of Judas Iscariot, or Yehuda Ishkariot, who betrayed Jesus to the Jewish council for, quote, 30 silver coins, which led to his crucifixion. This story sits at the heart of anti-Semitism and Jewish persecution. It was even used in Nazi propaganda, where Judas betrayed Christ, the Jews betrayed Germany. To be a Judas is to be a betrayer. In conservation, the Judas is an animal forced to betray its friends. A wild female donkey is captured and fitted with a radio collar around her neck. She is then released. When she returns to her herd, she unknowingly betrays them to shooters who can now follow her wherever she goes. Her entire herd will be killed, but not her. Donkeys are deeply social, particularly females. She will be left alive to search for new companions and is condemned to lead shooters to every other donkey she joins. She will witness her friends killed over and over again until she is left alone to be shot last. How did conservation develop to regard such atrocities as benevolence? To answer this, we need to look into the roots of conservation, and when we look, we find that conservation is embedded in chauvinistic ideologies. Recognizing this is the first step. The second step is to begin to discover what would a feminist conservation be like. The conservation project is without a doubt a noble and life-affirming mission. It aims to ensure that human needs and desires are met in a manner that allows the rest of the Earth's diverse life forms to flourish. I fundamentally believe in this mission. But conservation does have a dark side. Conservation as a profession is primarily led by science, which deals with empirical knowledge. Conservation science produces knowledge about how humans influence living systems and how to protect them. But conservation also has clear ethical dimensions. It tells us not only about how the world is, but how it ought to be and how we ought to behave. Scientists like me are taught how to analyze data. Most of us, though, are not taught how to analyze ethical positions. So even clearly problematic cultural influences underlying conservation tend to remain unacknowledged and entrenched. Individual conservationists, of course, hold a wide range of values and beliefs, but Western conservation as a whole broadly reflects Western culture, and Western culture remains tethered to chauvinistic ideologies. Chauvinism, in essence, is the cultural belief that it is appropriate for members of one group to objectify and oppress members of another group. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum defined objectification as the treatment of a subject as an instrument that can be owned, replaced, and violated, as an object that is denied autonomy, agency, and subjectivity. Ecofeminists have long drawn compelling parallels between the objectification and oppression of women and the objectification and oppression of animals and nature. Despite conservation's egalitarian mission to reduce harmful human impacts on other organisms, it does so within a framework that treats wild animals as objects that should be under human control. It is common practice for conservation programs to use wild animals against their interests. They can be captured and bred in captivity, bought and sold, exhibited alive in zoos or dead on the walls of rich men. They can have tracking devices attached to their bodies or surgically inserted into their bodies. They are killed to reduce their numbers, or their predators are killed to increase their numbers. They can be fenced in or fenced out, reintroduced or exterminated. They are living beings treated as if they were things. There are three key ethical positions in conservation that most strongly reflect its chauvinistic roots. These are instrumentalism, collectivism, and nativism. Instrumentalism has a long history influencing conservation. It is, in essence, the belief that entities should be valued as means to other ends. For example, a hammer has instrumental value for knocking in nails. In conservation, instrumentalism is the belief that wild animals and nature should be primarily evaluated based on their ecosystem services, economic value, or other instrumental values. Instrumentalism is chauvinistic because it treats subjects as objects. Intrinsic value is the philosophical counter to instrumentalism. It is the value of an entity for its own sake, over and above any uses it may serve. Carpenters, for example, do have instrumental value, but their fundamental intrinsic value as human beings, as subjects, is also rightly recognized and respected. When we recognize that someone has intrinsic value, we also believe it would be unconscionable to treat them as mere objects with reckless disregard for their well-being. Practices that treat wild animals as expendable means to conservation ends effectively cast them as moral equivalents of hammers. Wild donkeys are even worse off than hammers. They are not useful beasts of burden anymore. They are not African wild asses anymore. They are neither useful tools nor intrinsically worthy beings. Collectivism is the most fundamental and enduring ethical position in conservation. It is the view that the group should be valued over its individual members. In conservation, a collective is a population, species, or ecosystem. Almost all leading conservation organizations consider the persistence of these collectives as the only objective. In this worldview, individual wild animals are regarded as instances of their type, rather than as unique and distinct beings. An organism's population size then becomes the most important thing conservationists need to know about them. That is why it is considered legitimate to cause boundless harms to individual wild animals for the sake of some greater good. Collectivism is chauvinistic because it denies individuals their subjectivity and treats them as things that can be violated. The philosopher Tom Regan criticized conservation's singular focus on protection of species as, quote, environmental fascism, because it blinds us to the wrongs enacted against individual animals. Many animals are known to have deeply complex cognitive, emotional, and social lives. What this means is that animals, like humans and donkeys, are sentient beings, and we have particularly strong moral obligations towards sentient beings. Collectivism makes it possible to treat wild donkeys as killable objects, and it also places the bar for killing very low. Most lethal conservation programs do not halt extinctions or even aim to. Killing donkeys certainly would not prevent extinctions or stem any other catastrophe. Donkeys endure extreme suffering and trauma in mass killing programs, but this is simply not counted because the only thing that matters is the goal of achieving some greater good of the conservation project, no matter how vague that goal may be. Nativism is a relatively new belief in conservation, but it has certainly become extremely influential in the past 2 decades. It is the view that wildlife whose biological or geographic trajectories that have been influenced substantially by human civilization are not wildlife. These are the wildlife disparagingly called feral and invasive species. Many regions that were colonized by Europeans now define nature as the ecological state at the immortalized moment when the first Europeans stepped off a boat. Writer Emma Maris calls this the white dude moment. The European colonialists of the past viewed this as the moment nature became civilized. The European conservationists of today see this as the moment nature was destroyed. These two views aren't really so different. They both reflect the belief that the presence of European humans fundamentally eliminates nature. They also both reflect the belief that European humans are completely different kinds of beings than the other humans who had shaped these landscapes for thousands of years. The work of conservation has developed with the aim to recreate and hold ecosystems in the image that immediately predates the arrival of white men. So quite clearly, there is no room in conservation for wild donkeys. Nativism is chauvinistic for another reason, which is that it fundamentally denies subjects their autonomy and agency. Wild donkeys defy conservation because they make their own decisions. They step outside of the boundaries that humans have set. They don't know or care that humans have set them. They make their own lives in their own way. They make nature too wild. Wild animals like donkeys, whose ancestors escaped domestication, commit 2 unforgivable sins. They escape human control, and they mess up our picture of nature as an untouched Garden of Eden. So they must be banished, so to speak. They are banished with guns and traps and government programs. They are even banished from scientific data. The IUCN Red List is conservation's primary database for assessing the distribution, population trends, and threats to the world's species. But the Red List doesn't simply document the world as it is. It documents only the parts of the world conservation accepts. You will not see Australia in the distribution maps of any plant or animal if they arrived there after James Cook did. You will not see North America in the distribution maps of any plant or animal if they arrived there after Christopher Columbus did. You will not find a single wild donkey in the IUCN Red List, and that is conservation chauvinism. Feminism calls for our relationships with one another to be fundamentally reshaped. Feminists are concerned with creating a society in which we treat one another as subjects with respect for each other's unique subjectivity, dignity, interests, and agency. Feminism would radically reshape conservation because it would be founded on a primary commitment to treat animals as subjects. It would recognize the intrinsic value of wildlife and of nature. It would be committed to the well-being of individual sentient wild animals alongside the persistence of species. It would value all creatures, whether common or rare, whether native or not. It would be, in essence, a compassionate conservation. The field of compassionate conservation strives to safeguard the Earth's biological diversity through a commitment to treating individual wild animals with compassion. This commitment doesn't change when an animal is moved, when an animal goes feral, or when an animal exerts a strong ecological pressure of one kind or another. Its primary motivation is not to return ecosystems to a pre-white man state, but to move forward to create societies that treat other organisms with compassion, respect, and justice. One project compassionate conservation scientists have engaged with is finding out what the world looks like when we include all species in our data sets, feral donkeys and all. When we recognize wild donkeys as the wild animals that they are, we also discover that the Earth is in some respects wilder today than it has been for thousands of years. The world used to be full of terrestrial megafauna, which are broadly defined as land mammals that are larger, or much larger, than 100 kilograms. Many were lost at the end of the Pleistocene, probably due to human hunting. But today, around the world, megafauna are coming back. Introduced and feral megafauna have numerically replaced between 15% and 67% of species lost in the Pleistocene. Australia lost all of its megafauna species 50,000 years ago. There are now 8 introduced species in Australia, including wild donkeys. Many of the megafauna species that survive to today are now endangered, but some have found refuge in new areas. About a third of the Earth's megafauna have established introduced populations. Of these, half are threatened or even extinct in their native ranges. The dromedary camel was native to North Africa and the Levant before going extinct in the wild about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Today, a population of about 500,000 wild dromedary camels are rewilding the deserts of Australia. Aurochs were hunted to extinction hundreds of years ago, but they live on in the thousands of wild cattle of Australia, Europe, North America, South America, and several islands. The IUCN lists wild horses as surviving only in Mongolia, but there are hundreds of thousands of feral horses in the world, and most of them are in Australia. Even hippos have found a new home. Pablo Escobar, the archetypal patriarch, created his very own private zoo at his Colombian estate. When he was killed, a small number of his cocaine hippos escaped. Their offspring are now rewilding South America. If species were assessed across their full range, 6 megafauna species would be globally delisted and 2 would be downlisted, which would reduce the number of threatened megafauna by 13%. In fact, our new research, led by the ecologist Erik Lundgren, is revealing that about a quarter of the world's introduced mammals are threatened in their native ranges. These introduced threatened species should be thought of more as refugees rather than as invaders. These incredible rewilding events did not occur by human direction and control. They are the results of the agency and pioneering abilities of animals that have survived human exploitation. There are thousands of similar stories that are making the world wilder. On islands, introductions have doubled plant richness and tripled fish richness. On continents, plant and fish richness has increased by 20%. Introductions have increased plant and animal richness in Israel and increased vertebrate richness in Australia. All of these introduced populations integrate into their ecosystems and contribute unique functions. In Arizona, wild donkeys dig wells of more than a meter in depth in the drying riverbeds of the Sonoran Desert. Erik Lundgren's research revealed that these wells increase water availability for more than 30 mammal and bird species and become nurseries for riparian trees and even for tadpoles. Celebrating animals like wild donkeys does not mean that species and ecosystems are replaceable objects. We can simultaneously mourn for what the world has lost and cherish what remains and what is thriving. A more feminist conservation has always been here, and in some places it is growing. In the Kimberley, after years of mass killing, there are very few donkeys left, but one safe place remains. Kachana Cattle Station views them as an integral part of what makes the Kimberley alive and beautiful. They are protecting the wild donkeys on their land and working with them to reduce fire, capture water, and enrich soil. Across Australia, many Indigenous people do not want wild donkeys to be killed. At Mount Willoughby Station, Aboriginal land in South Australia, wild donkeys are free from harm. Some introduced animals have even been given names in Yangunjara, such as Nanju for wild horses and Mulgu for wild cats. Studies of Aboriginal people's views on feral animals reveals a radically more generous view to that of whitefella conservation. As one man said most beautifully, "Yeah, but they belong to this land now. We can't push them out, any of them. Camel, donkey, kangaroo, emu, they belong to this land."